Jerry Catt, how are you?
I'm well.
It's very nice to have you in here.
Thank you.
We
Really good to be here, Aaron.
Yeah, it's nice to reconvene at different parts in our lives for sure.
Yeah.
You were actually my college professor, and we have become pretty good friends since.
That means you must have been one of my classes.
Once or twice.
Once or twice. Huh?
If I was showing up on time, for sure.
Yeah. You were exceptional student.
Thank you.
I say.
You held space very well for students to grow and be themselves and really learn from each other. And I tell people often, one of the best collegiate decisions I made was to switch from my business degree into the comm department. And you were a major staple in that feeling. You really did help me and everybody in the classroom, whether or not they realized it, open up and understand that there's more ways to see something, not just from a human perspective, but from a scholarly perspective as well. I really, really appreciate that.
I'm wondering which class do you think it was that had the impact? Was that perspectives you're talking about, perspectives of inquiry?
I would think so, yes.
Okay, it sounds like that when you talk about opening up the idea that scholarly perspectives are many.
Yes, I know I took multiple of your classes during the same 2 semesters, and so they blended in very well for me. And also, I was with you many hours in the week, listening, perspectives of inquiry. It really built this really beautiful foundation for me to appreciate university a little bit more than I actually was. It was pretty frustrating for me up to an extent, of course. And I don't know, you really helped open up doors for me in an educated sense that are literally with me while I do this episode, while I do this podcast, while I have relationships with people. And one of my favorite things about you as a teacher and a student in your own world is the fact that you recognize everybody as a teacher and everybody as a student. And as you can see in this room, that Eastern philosophy means a lot to me. And you really built an environment for people to open up and not be afraid to share themselves and not be afraid to listen a little bit deeper. And it's very, very impactful.
I think the impact of, you've taken 3 of my classes in a semester. You heard 3 presentations, regardless of the class content, that had to do with the methodology that I approached it with. That is the model that Parker Palmer had developed that dealt with the myth of teaching and learning and offered the alternative view, which was the community of truth. And some students got to hear that lecture at least 3 times. So you were pretty much put on notice that the sage on stage wouldn't appear, and that I was interested in joining in a dialogue, getting a conversation going. And I thought it was imperative that I try to practice what I was going to teach. That is to say, communication begins with listening. So trying to tune into where each class would start and where you could feel like maybe it was going to go was, I think, what you experienced, but it was also the contribution of everybody in the classroom. You know, you made the impact as much as I did, in other words.
How the sage on stage wouldn't appear. That's an amazing phrase. I remember the first day of our class, the first time I ever met you, I mentioned controlled chaos. You put up an image on the board and it literally looked like controlled chaos. There's a series of interlooping lines and this diagram that made some form somehow. And oh man, that was during the beginning of my plant medicine journeys.
Oh.
And you called me out in a sense of like, what do you mean by controlled chaos? And from there on, I really felt comfortable being who I was in that setting. And a lot of that takes the courage to just share and open up in a classroom setting like that. But a lot of that is also on your end to welcome that in students and to provide an environment for them to comfortably dig a little bit deeper. And it's very naturally bled into our relationship. We had coffee last week, and you were blowing my mind for 3 hours straight with just resource after resource, and you explaining what means so much to me internally from a completely different perspective. And that to me is so fascinating. It's incredible, these big T capital truths that seem to be popping up under different scenarios, under different circumstances from different parts of the world. Some in the jungle, some in a library. And I'd really love to touch base on just the overall aspect of what communication even is. And really just paint people a picture here. And no joke, you are a huge reason why this podcast was built in the terms of using genuine discussion to build new ground of meaning. How there's a world inside of you that I may never have access to without your help, and vice versa. How can we really come together, offer insight, offer perspective to hopefully discover something or a place where neither of us have ever been before? That is so beautiful to me. So thank you once again.
Well, thank you for those are very, very kind words. You can imagine it would mean a lot to any instructor to have that kind of impact, of course. And I remember easily I was referring to that Parker Palmer's model, the community of truth, which demonstrates just what you're talking about. Everybody becomes an expert in their own experience. And in place of, at the center of that being a scholar, that a subject becomes the center of what we're investigating. And I take a seat around the circle just like everyone else, but there's lines of communication between everybody that's present. And trying to foster that is controlled chaos. As far as the big T truth, I was reflecting as you were thinking about that. We should change that. I would change that. I don't think I was certainly not, I certainly didn't possess or obtain while I was there some big T truth as such. There was a big C truth, though. A big C truth, I'll call it. It's conversation. It's what happened between us, at coffee. And I'd qualify that it's not just simply communication. There's all kinds of forms of communication, as I've shared before. And conversation seems to me to be the one that is the highest quality, if you were to think of it in just quality terms, that we transcend something of the limitations that you're talking about to get beyond what our scripts are into sort of an open learning environment that there's so much to know about ourselves that we don't even get to know about until someone comes along and says something. There's so much for us to learn that alters how we think about ourselves. through interaction with others at the level of conversation. And I'm not going to suggest that that can't happen in diatribe. Okay, diatribe, I mean, somebody hollers at you and says, you're being a real, jerk. You can learn from that. But conversation, I think, is a sustained, first of all, it's a sustained generosity and kindness that you're offering when you're listening to someone. And from it, be careful, because intimacies grow, and out of intimacies grow what we consider needful is commitment. And that's what I would say maybe fosters community, is commitment of that nature that comes through the conversation that is only had through the processes of listening.
Wow. How do people begin to listen better? Or what are some of the components involved in a healthy discussion or sense of communication or conversation?
Well, my answer is coming from where I'm currently focused. And so I have what would be an immediate response that I'm not sure would work. But imagine a world where listening was as valuable as we think of reason being valuable. You have to imagine that, because you're going to find today in your getting around that listening isn't given that place or value. But imagine it. Just imagine, this harkens back for me to John Lennon, Okay, but imagine a world where listening is really valued and important. So in that sense, I believe we really do have to begin, with imagination. To begin with, to imagine what it might be like to be that exposed, to be vulnerable, because listening has some element of vulnerability in it. At an intellectual level, opening your mind to new ideas means you're vulnerable to changing your old ideas. You may find out that you've been carrying around beliefs that really are false. Imagine that you really don't fully understand what a person means. Too often we imagine we do. So at the present time, I think we have to work with our imaginations much more than I had any idea when I started out thinking about listening. So I guess to start with, I'd say, let's cultivate imagination. When we have such wisdom artifacts, I'll call them, walk a mile in someone else's shoe, for instance, we've heard that, if you get in their skin, those kind of metaphors tell us that we have to do some imagining. We have to move outside of our perceptions of the world that have formulated into our beliefs, I think. And that opening, that vulnerability is, I think we're resistant to it. And that way we can kind of stay with the scripts, stay with the approved paths. So I think that's what's involved, or at least what we're faced with, in order to get underway something to become a better listener.
Do you think that's why it might be easier for some people to just do as they're told and have people just accept this is how you do it, this is what this means, instead of actually pondering or wondering the deeper meaning inside of something? Because if someone wonders the deeper meaning, they have a chance to be wrong in their vulnerability. Therefore, in a sense, fear or worry might be actually driving away the imagination. Because if I open up my heart to you and I get vulnerable and your world doesn't suit my opened heart, then there's this weird balance and play of I mean, damaged people, but only damaged not in the sense of because they got hurt, but because we don't know how to cope with things, because we don't really know how to come back from deeper vulnerable states efficiently, it seems like. And that's probably why meditation for me really means a lot, because it allows me to ground within those deeper states of vulnerability and almost move a baseline deeper and deeper. And when I feel it get kind of shocked a little bit, I do something very open-hearted and it may not register the best with some people. Just like you said earlier, that's an opportunity for me to learn something. Because every moment really is a teacher if you allow it to be, or if we even perceive it to be that way. Where does imagination come in play with that? How do we stay open?
Well, I think the dialectic tension that you've suggested is between authority and imagination, which, if we take some stab at trying to explain what is imagination, we're already in deep water. And many of us don't have the imagination to imagine. That has been a process of being educated. Early on, we have authority imposed on what is, talk about controlled chaos. The imagination of children is, well, it's to begin with, it's inexplicable. It's hard to explain where children are getting these wild ideas that they get. If you have any recollection of your childhood, you know how fertile your imagination was. I suppose that, centuries of laying over authority to bring imagination into something that can be managed is what education has had to deal with. It's easy to fault that process, but at the same time, there are so many indicators, I think, in society today where children's imaginations have been so overlaid with authority that we have to really go back and discover what imagination is, sort of in a primal sense, or before the fact of our education. In other words, how do I escape from my own thinking in the ways that I've accepted authoritarian views and viewpoints, which what is a belief, what is an ideology, and at what point do I go back and kind of clean the slate and say, let me start over here. I want some new crayons. I think that's what subsequent generations are there for us to look at. And instead of imposing that kind of administration that is an authority in itself, however well intended, that we're not maybe as attuned to how these rich imaginations are coming. And if there's any evolutionary sense in your thinking, it's like perhaps they're carrying the seeds of understanding that I'm not going to get at 72 until I listen to someone that's 6 or 7 years old, right? So you're right on with the issue of what's at this question of authority. You could tease this out further into more serious and the vein in our society where, I have evil imaginations. I have an imagination that would put this person in their place or ignore this person because I imagine they're really not worth the time to spend on them. By dropping names, Jacques Lacan spends an awful lot of time with the imaginary real. As we kind of talked on that subject, and that's something for us to think about: is how the imagination, even in a very personal sense, we catastrophize. We see the worst happening in our imagination, in our mind's eye, and unfortunately, we're not even conscious of that process going on until someone may step up and say, why are you worrying? It's not very likely that's going to happen. And, you can take a deep breath, but it's pretty consistent with us. And some of us, myself included, I feel like I'm maybe worse off than others who have not had some of the training that we get that tries to bring that fertile imagination under control.
The way you describe that feels like we are always imagining something, one way or another. Because you described in a sense of worry is imagination. Positive thinking is imagination. Our thought patterns produce this image that we somehow feel the visceral effects of. That's kind of like a dream state. It's really interesting because you mentioned how do you break away from your natural patterns and kind of build a different perspective with your imagining process. Compassion. I feel like compassion is such a beautiful way to feel, not just see how somebody else is feeling or what they're going through, but to actually feel what they may be experiencing. This has been such a beautiful way for me to practice broadening my awareness on one subject, which is really how we experience life, the subject of human experience. Being able to empathize or build some form of comprehension around other people's position in this experience we all share. That's really, to me, you just really hit a light bulb earlier.
I think of when you're bringing this question of compassion, and certainly we're dealing with affects that, and by affect, that's for me covers the entire range of emotional possibilities from where our feelings get involved. And the imagination is not devoid of some work there, I don't believe. I think of, well, we could really elevate this conversation, talk about love, and then the next thing we know, we'd probably find our imaginations are pretty paltry to deal with such a phenomenon as that kind of compassion that issues in love of the neighbor that you're talking about. How do you have that for someone who's hanging on to an AR-15, for instance? It takes a lot of imagination for me to think about how to face that world that is antagonistic, means to control. And of course that brings us into the question of what religions have attempted to do and throughout human history to deal with those things. And oddly, at least from my perspective, they've complicated by their own evil imagination through control in ways that we deal with, and we don't oftentimes. It's an unpleasant thing to face. But I want to go back and stay. I think kind of bracket that for a minute and go back to this idea of what are these images doing? Because imagination is more, according to Gaston Bachelard, these images they deconstruct for us. They make possible a reconstruction of the way images have become internalized into our perceptions that then crystallize or galvanize our thinking. And something has to come in and break those structures down. And at least as I've been trying to work with imagination, I see that if I start opening myself to those kinds of images and accounting for them, I know that there's a range of possibility. I know that there's images that say, well, you have to protect yourself. People have AR-15s, so you maybe should get an AR-15. I know better because my mind is full of images that have seen the kind of havoc we've created in a world where that kind of imaginary has held sway for so long that we walk around in paranoia. Who knows what our children really deal with in terms of those imaginations. Today we're seeing newscast and the awareness of children who go to school and have to go through exercises. What were this to happen? And I certainly don't want to take this conversation off on a very tragic footing here, but it's a reality too. And we've answered to that by adding more authority, more force. And I think your awareness that there's something that we could learn about trying other ways that fuels the imagination as you meditate and open yourself to how to non-violently be able to take care of yourself and take care of others, even in the face of those, we'll call them tragic circumstances. And we're not that practiced at it. And of course, my answer to that is coming back to how do we listen inside of ourselves to prevent ourselves from building those kind of defenses that will never issue in the kind of connections that are necessary to overcome those tragedies. How do we reach out? Your presence in the classroom was one of someone who, for whatever reason, I guess I would say you were gifted to be able to be one of those people who open up and to reach out and to explore. And it's your first impulse, not your third. And that's from a conditioning, I suspect, that you had a path you were walking that made you susceptible to the way that I conducted the classroom. You were, it was like a cosmic fit at that point for both of us, because I was receiving as much as you were, right? And there was that initial fear of the instructor, the fear of the professor, the fear of the guy who's going to give you the grade, that I think was quickly dispelled because I made it clear that this grading business is in your own hands. Here's the syllabus, here's what we're going to try to do. And I think that you faced your own fears, including that fear of, what's this instructor like? What's he going to demand? And of course, instead of reinforce that demanding place, I was trying to open up an environment where I could learn, to be honest with you, because I really like learning stuff. So, including how my own imagination has been compromised and seemingly is nonetheless very fertile if I just cultivate and listen to and he said it was almost like dreaming. And I would use Bachelard again to mention his notion of reverie, how important the French term reverie is about daydreaming. And we do too little of that. And the positive side of the imagination, I think, where we learn that we could be this or we could be that, or, wouldn't it work really nice if that were to, and that's obviously the condition we'd like to get to, in contrast to the wicked imagination, which I was taught we have wicked imaginations, and of course there's enough evidence around you to go off on that line and never come back, but at the same time, look around you. There's a lot of amazing things that are taking place that aren't natural. They're not a given. They're a product of imagination that's put maybe people first, or maybe put that connection that we all long for first. And we know that there are some people, by their own imagination, can capture ours so quickly. So,
how does this play into building a better tribe or community of people?
Boy, you just don't like to answer how it's easy answers. You have to ask those complex questions. I'm just gonna try this, because what's coming to me is I took a 3-week trip to the west coast of Africa. This was in about 1996. At the time, there was that word tribe was very positive in our society. People were talking about tribes. I think there was even one of the first internet communities was the tribe or something of that nature.
That's cool.
And I was trying to think of the Etny Reader had a special edition on tribes. And I got really enthused about that, because Boise was at a place in its own growth where you could see the outline of tribes and people getting together, and the downtown was developing, and all kinds of cool things were going on. But when I got to Benin, in the west coast of Africa, and within the perimeter of what would be from Boise to Caldwell, there were some 22 dialects, and they weren't understood by all 22 dialects were unique, and so there was a lot of those tribes warred. They had an inability to communicate, as it were, and lived still with those kinds of tensions that our romantic notions of tribes don't necessarily carry. So I would say, first of all, I'm worried about how quickly we form tribes rather than become, what is that, emissary role? One of the workshops I used to do with students was to try to illustrate what a listening community was like. And that is to say, they had to, as a group, a community, I called them clans, as I put them together, because we got tired of using the word group, and I wanted them to feel that clannishness of being together, and they had to come up with what was their common beliefs, and then they needed to send off 2 emissaries to another clan to explain those beliefs and learn of the beliefs of others, and to be conscious of themselves as they were listening during that process.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really quite interesting, because there was a a pretty good mixture of people that held different religious perspectives. We certainly in Boise aren't what I would, at that time anyway, was not a culture of many different tribes and clans. But thankfully now we've got, with the refugee programs, we've been successful in establishing more of that. And we get good food out of that, by the way, too. I don't know if you noticed, you know. I got to get myself back on track here, because that kind of tribalism would be perhaps something to be cherished, where we had the capacity to understand beyond our own tribal boundaries, beyond our own tribal preferences, and move from this idea of some central overriding truth for all the tribes. That's beyond my purview to know what that should be like for a tribe that I'm unfamiliar with. But boy, my proclivity for doing that throughout my middle years was high. I had the universal truth, so to speak. And today, just from working with people like yourself, it's more like a universal conversation we need, you know, let the truth take care of itself, and let's find a way to converse so that, and part of it is owning our own uniqueness and what we like, and being with those that we really are stimulated by, but there are others outside of ourselves, and that othering is what we're not doing the work of, at least in my view, in a way that is promising. And again, let me say, the other side of that is there are many people who are doing this work and reaching into that otherness, and it's hard for me to even keep up with that. So I don't know if I answered anything.
I think you did. Towards the end, you brought it back to a conversation.
Yeah.
What are the common threads between our imaginations, between our belief systems? Where can we really find that ground of meaning, of mutual meaning? And that only comes through conversing with one another. And hopefully that's from a genuine, non-judgmental platform. And that doesn't mean that it has to begin that way, but hopefully that develops and blossoms through the conversation itself. And that's where our engagement is so necessary when doing anything, because I've really seen that with this podcast. My engagement into it has helped it morph and develop how it should on its own. It almost feels like a very mutual relationship in building something. It's almost like having a discussion or some form of back and forth with a form of energy or being. I mean, this thing feels alive. It moves. It has energy to it. And that's very dense in Eastern philosophy, in the terms of we are equal to everything and everything is equal to us, whether it is inanimate or not. And I really take that to heart. Maybe that's a part of my own imagination. I don't know. Imagining things to be mutual or equal in their value. Don't know. I'm going to really look at this. I don't imagine often, I don't believe. I feel more than I imagine. And because feeling for me brings me to presence, and I believe that present motion builds the proper blossomed future. But to potentially work in different dimensions within that process, I'm going to start to incorporate. So thank you for that. What are some really powerful resources that you would be able to share or offer people who would be even interested in this kind of information?
Well, before I go off on the resources, it'll take me a minute to narrow those down to some aim that you identified. But I want to address something I think you were talking about in terms of how your emotions, your feelings, you're in touch with that. You're conscious of that. And I want to say that one step again would be to, let's make ourselves conscious of our imagination, because I think it's at play. I don't think that you lack imagination. I think we lack awareness of how imagination can make a difference. My turn to resource, of course, is Listen for a Change. And that has a entendre there that, someone hears that and they've probably heard it too often in that negative sense. It's like, you need to listen for a change, kind of thing. Well, there's a positive side to that, is that if we want change in the world, we're going to need to learn to listen. So, by way of saying, I think that making yourself conscious of your imagining just as much as you do your feelings, because I know for me, I spent a good deal of my life monitoring, surveilling my emotions. After a certain point in my 20s where I became aware that it's like, well, guys are emotional, and understanding how to stay tuned to what was going on in the emotive fields. And you're right, there's an incredible amount of that energy that comes to us through, whether it is discussion, and I take discussion to be something different than conversation. It's the give and take, the almost percussive kind of talk that David Bohm actually identifies it as percussive. That is to say, we're banging ideas off of each other. We debate, that sort of thing. Conversation, again, I would say is of a different quality, and I'm going to use the word dialogue here in that, because I think your podcast is trying to promote a dialogue of that nature, and it does begin sometimes with conflicting ideas. How is it our interpretations are so far from one another? How is it that I have somehow or another managed to interpret very complex data in ways that complicate it further? That is to say, I think one of David Bohm's significant remarks was in the quantum world that we've now discovered is far beyond our mechanical universe that Newton left us legacy to. Is that, the opposite of a profound truth in the quantum world is not some profound falsehood. Instead, it's another profound truth. And so, at what level do we, understand that we keep needing to change and transform into some higher understanding? And it appears that everything that drives this is dialogue. This dialogue, through the logos, through the discourse. And I'm idealist, as you know, and so consequently, I tire easily anymore of debate. I don't enjoy as much as I did at one time watching the rhetorical features of a discussion that people are having, and then identify the pathos and the ethos and the logos. And I think my transformation became more real to me when I looked at mythos and included that into our rhetorical thing, and began to think about how we're shaped by these myths that we need to understand. And imagination is the avenue into understanding how we've come to think mythically. And that, I believe, will help us, as resource goes, to become more adept at being interpreters in the world who understand that what the myths have taught us, whether east, west, north, south, every culture has its mythologies, that at the heart of everything is a mythopoetic, and it takes various forms in different cultures, as Ricoeur talks about that. And I'm reaching for a mythopoetic that transcends reason at this point, in the work of imagination or poesis, I'm reaching toward a mythopoetic of listening, that I'm promulgating the myth that we can listen for a change. And if we want to change, listen may become more important to us than reason, because our reasons can be so short-sighted. However right they are for my tribe, the next tribe, that reason might not play out. So there again, I'm amazed at how I can complexify things. One of my students says, I don't know how you can complexify things like that. I'd never heard that word before. And I tried to look it up, and it's like he gave me a new word, right? So
that is the beauty, though, in how you interpret information. You find how one word can bridge into a completely different world. That to me shows deep intelligence. And you're finding commonalities through information. And we briefly talked about that at coffee, in the sense of the common themes through different people and their own backgrounds. And that to me holds a lot of importance, not just how things are different. I really don't pay much attention to how things are different. I'm not sure why. Deep down, I just don't feel like it's important for me to be paying attention to. I really do my best to find the common truths between the threads that bond everything between. I feel like that's more worth my energy or attention or presence, really. That's what attention is.
yeah.
The more attentive we are, the more present we can be.
Yeah.
And I guess in a sense of imagination, perhaps I'm choosing to be more present with the imagination of what is common.
And I would say that you're touching on what Aristotle's understanding was about genius is in finding likeness or similarity. That would be the commonness. I think that the terminology that you're using as commonness would have to do with you're looking for where the similarity is, and there's genius in that. The other side of that at some point is like, well, then you've been able to at least recognize that there's not similarity too. So that would be, but the primary importance of making the kind of collective and community connections is in that commonality. We've been, I think, privileged to, in my lifetime, is learning the importance of differences and regarding those differences and trying to find that there can be something like a unity or a commonness even in that diversity. And in fact, it seems to me that opens onto a world where that complementariness of our differences is precisely what we need. And looking at it from a biological lens, you can think about monocultures and what's happened is monocultures, and when diversity is of the ecosystem is tragic, and well, that's a whole nother podcast. But there are people who are tuned to listening to those interactions that have those. I think of it in terms of valences. There's a point where this can bond, and that
maybe why I feel like I don't enjoy putting much focus or attention on the differences is because, from my personal experience in perceiving the world, the people who focus on the differences usually focus on separation and divergence, and really pulling away, like they are different. So, I mean, let's start a war, just to say in the best way possible.
Yeah.
And So, I mean, this can root in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different people, in terms of, they see people with money be horrible people. So now they push away this aspect of income or revenue or money because it's associated with something in a negative connotation. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's why it's been a natural response from my environment to hone into deeper things.
Well, and you might be in the backwash of our effort towards segregation. And if you think about that from my point of view, back in the 50s when that project got underway, we were trying to bring differences together, and probably long before we had the means of really understanding, how to go about that. And so there was quite a bit of backlash in that time, and there's the backlash that exists today, and we see it in our political rancor today. That's still present. And I think that what your chief interest in, and we've talked about this, is about integration. Because separation is a part of our existence. We're leaving something behind to transform. You can call it separation, maybe. Separate yourself from that bad idea, Jerry. That's, there are some of my imaginings that I need to divorce, I guess. But the thrust of this work of integration then recognizes that there's a movement here, and that just in terms of the way we understand how to go about dealing with it presents us a challenge, because we're quite clearly, we're still in our infancy when it comes to these movements that include the radical fringe. Or if we're going to have compassion, are we going to have compassion for the radical fringe, or are we just going to have compassion for those that kind of fit into where it's easy for me to have compassion on these people? Do you know what I'm trying to say? It's like there's a range here that I think that I'm working with a sort of a mystical concept that been promulgated by East and Western mystics alike. That wisdom is justified of all her children, and trying to find place for that is the work of integration, where it's from the radical passive to the radical active. There's got to be some way of integrating these, and that's almost the work of transcendence, it seems to me. So,
wow. So that could open up a completely different room for this discussion, just involving the integration. From my personal experiences, whether it's in my own world or talking about this concept with other people, it seems like integration is a move towards wholeness and deeper understanding, whether it's integrating trauma or integrating better habits or integrating these visceral spiritual experiences into our behavior. So there's that other sense of integration of better knowledge, better resources, better education, better information. And that's probably where we have been brought as a civilization right now, is we now have access to so much information, it can become so unbelievably overwhelming. How do we find what's proper, what builds some gravitational pull that can hopefully be moved towards the betterment of others and for the good of all? What kind of ripple can we build or platform that we can provide that actually benefits as much as possible? And I believe we really have that opportunity now. That's what's so powerful about YouTube or podcasts or the internet or world travel now, and being able to record all of these different experiences in a very efficient way. With as little, I mean, we can edit it like crazy, but we can also record it as purely as possible. We can capture emotion in audio. We can really capture someone's body language through visual representation. And of course, we can put a thematic approach on that. But the purity in that holds so much potential, it's unreal.
Well, that was another difficult question. The truthful answer is I don't know. My speculation, which if you'll permit me to speculate, is that if integration is going to be our doorway into that future, we also have to carry with us an awareness of disintegration and the prospect of what we presently know needing at some point, again, to go through that disintegration. And it likely will. And I think of, and I've thought this for a long time. I was challenged at a young age that, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Wisdom has something to do with how you make it work, the know-how to apply this knowledge that in a way that does make the kind of difference that you would have, as opposed to getting that backlash that you'd like to avoid. And the way to wisdom, through some hard knocks, I guess.
Is that integration?
Certainly it's
it's an embodiment of something.
Yeah, certainly is. And at the same time, the pain from the learning experience can oftentimes, deter our interest in getting more experience. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, I've been there, done that. I don't think I want to take any more risk. What I learned is this, and it becomes sort of a containment to going beyond and saying, well, what if I adjusted? I think this is where I like the imagination, and maybe I think of this more as theory, but what if I tried this time? Okay, I'm gonna, I still have bruises, but I think if I just did this, I don't know where we learn that. You get up one more time, then you're down stuff. Certainly, I suppose communities, it seems like your body work tends to push people to that end. It's like, you will survive this. I don't know if you could say that about, I'm thinking about that in currently right now in this conversation. Is like, will I survive the Christianity that I had been beaten up with? For instance, it's certainly not in the same form. I've got to do things that rearrange how I think about that and what I've been taught. Just like you would adjust your body to, learning to stretch, learning to do something different, learning to do it a different way. What are the mechanics of it? That kind of know-how is very nuanced. Communication and interpretation is a part of that. And again, I take that to be you're listening very carefully to your body. You're very attuned to something going on there that pain speaks. So does sorrow. The good side of this is so does joy. So does pleasure.
Absolutely.
Are we listening? And I'd rather listen to this one side, and yet I really learn from this pain and.
Yeah, right. Well, there's a lesson in everything, but I know. We can talk about that in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
We talked about that recently, and that can be taken. But I wonder if this aspect of adjusting or listening or getting back up one more time is rooted in openness. the openness to more instead of closing off to what's happened, the closing off from experience, rather opening up to, hopefully, maybe hope is a lot in that too, a potential doorway that has never been able to be reached before. Because through our trial and error, we gained so much personal awareness and experience that it really does feel like doors open up that were inaccessible beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes very, very deep, whether it's being able to be in a relationship with somebody else because of past experiences, whether it's a job opportunity because you were fired somewhere else. All of these things hold so much importance in, I believe, what is presented to us with the universe or with divine alignment. Maybe that's a deeper aspect of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yeah, I like that. Because I think of when you say rootedness, I start wondering about rootedness is about conditioning almost. If I reach a little bit beyond my rootedness, there's something there in the environment that also through photosynthesis has to take place, right? I mean, unless we just want roots, I guess we could be roots. But let's say that there's a plant here, and it's got to reach into the sky, and it's got to, whatever it is, be exposed out there to that environment. I wonder about this bare inaugural moment. I mentioned that the last time we talked, Bachelard's idea that, how is it some of this stuff isn't a product of growth? It seems to pop into my head. I mean, just out of nowhere. I can't even identify its source. There's no rootedness to it. In fact, it's just it's novel. It's the initial kind of big bang that starts a whole new place, and getting accustomed to that idea that both are necessary. The rootedness has got to be there. At the same time, there's something that I think for those of us who are sentient in the sense that we use symbols, that we can talk, and the way that we talk involves that openness. And well, here comes a new idea, and it's like, oh boy, how does that accommodate my rootedness? Well, sometimes you need transplanted. You need to be pulled right out, right? And it's like you need a whole new pod, sort of a thing. Let me tell you where that's very practical for me that I think touches on what you're talking about. I'm a person who is raised with a different idea about the body, the flesh, was to be subordinate to spirit. Kind of the legacy of Cartesian thought as well. Mind over matter. You don't worry about your body. I heard it expressed really well at a softball game, girls' softball game. I went to. My granddaughter was at a softball game, and third base, little girl, third base, has a grounder hit to her, and she misses it. She's at this, she doesn't get in front of it. And I hear the mother. This is the mother who says, "Sacrifice your body to those." And I'm like, wow. I don't know that little girl heard it. I don't know what she would have done with it had she heard it. It was obviously an error if it goes on the scorecard, right? What she needs is like, it's okay. It's just a game, right? Let's save the sacrifice for some of these later things. Maybe I'm kind of veering way off in this, but my own body I have ignored. I went to get a massage the other day. time I've had a massage in months, and my body, I did a lot of wreckage to it with the kind of trade that I was in prior to teaching. And this masseuse, I told her, she said, well, what's going on? And I said, well, I've got some, this here upper body stuff, and then, and then the lower extremities. And I said, I'm just going to leave it to you to find it. And boy, did she find it. I mean, she went right to it. And I wasn't 5 minutes under her care and therapy that I didn't realize. I told her, I said, this is like a podcast. She was reading, she was communicating with my body in ways that I can't even do. Right? So that kind of novelty for me is I'm having to learn and get open to this idea that I've ignored a part of myself that probably has inhibited a good deal of the spirituality that I've devoted myself to trying to to live into, and because I've taken up St. Francis's what did he say? He called his body brother ass. I'm wondering that I could think about that differently. And that it would be like my intelligence lies in my my body, and my maybe my spirit or soul is really brother ass. They're slow to come around because after all, I've privileged one thing over another instead of the integration or that attunement that you seem to be kind of trying to cultivate when you bring that consciousness and the body awareness together. And some kind of an intelligence comes out of that I don't have. I'm just beginning to learn at 70.
So this is bringing up a lot of points where we don't have video of this podcast, but I'm moving around a lot right now. Like, you're really stirring up a lot of energy to where, for me, this feels a lot like embodiment.
Yes.
And embodiment seems to be the bridge between spiritual or metaphysical into the physical. And it's fascinating because bringing this back to the thought aspect of where does a thought come from, or where do these feelings come from, or what are these recognitions, how do they even appear inside of our quote-unquote physical being or our aura of awareness. It really does feel like our bodies, our vessels, are a combination of different forms of energy. Energy that is produced and embodied within us consciously or unconsciously through our environments, through our behavior, through our resources, through the information that we consume and or are around. And when you combine all of these different forms of energy, they produce some form of common form. They produce something that is the combination of all the things that you are inhabiting or that are inhabiting you. This builds a frequency where thoughts or people or feelings can be attracted into. The energy that is emitted can help radiate a frequency that some metaphysical aspects are drawn towards, or perhaps, what's the right term right now? Repulsive to some people, or thoughts maybe. Maybe a certain person can't have certain thoughts because they don't even want to be inside of that frequency. So you start thinking about, when I read more, when I watch less Netflix, you actually start thinking different thoughts. There's something that is morphed in the environment within you that helps produce the environment outside of you, and vice versa. This to me has become a deep part of my personal focus in understanding my relationships, who I'm around, what I'm doing, and what that actually does to the feeling that is being felt in my personal experience. It feels like our cells hold so much information, and they're probably not going to be false. It's just, what is your interpretation of the information? Is this pain in a cold shower? Is that actually pain, or is it just sensation? Are you feeling pain before you even touch the cold water? What is your interpretation of said information? Which the information in general is just a fabric of existence that is just in the purest form of being in existence. So you start to understand that these different parts to our environments influence us internally. How do we cope with that? How do we build comfort within that? Comfort is composure. Composure is comfort. We become more comfortable within the stress. We better understand the stress. This is a phrase that really just went deep in one of my plant medicine journeys in Peru with Mother Ayahuasca. Was within stillness, we become. Plain and simple. Within stillness, we become. Whether that's more attuned, more composed, more aware. That is an open door to be interpreted within any person differently for their own world. It's so powerful. So powerful.
I think you've described in the recognition of what my language might go like this, these different energy signatures that are available to us, and they manifest in these what we now call multiple intelligences. Some people are tuned in a energy field, and they learn through motion. If they're not in motion, they're not learning. There are people who learn through tactility. If they haven't touched it, they don't know it. There's a whole range of intelligences that we're discovering today that might be as a consequence of the entertainment or welcoming of those different things, and maybe our genes predispose us to that or the other, and certainly not to all. Otherwise, I'd have been able to pole vault, which I can't do. And the place that I think you're wanting to take that is how that we, by reason of our perception, our senses, our interpretations, as it were, that become perceptions. Our perceptions do more interpreting than we realize, because we're, sort of pre-programmed. We talked about effective history and how it comes into play in every interpretation that you make, and I suspect that there's, sensible in the sense of the senses, if you can get all the combination of words that plays out. There's an attunement that history has, that there's like a predisposition, and I can't pole vault because I was convinced that was going to hurt before the fact, because I had fallen, and I'd fallen at some distance, and it was like, not 9 feet, but was my body already telling me? It's like, you don't want to go there. Steve's taking care of that part. Let him take care of that. You just need to get back on the track and run around and throw the discus. But that predisposition that then interprets the world for us, rather than allowing for imagining myself. Had I had coached myself in terms of being able to actually visualize and do those things, that Steve wasn't built that much differently than I, so I suspect I could have pole vaulted had I just had the imagination to train myself to whatever energy would have demanded of me at that point, and taken some risk to get the pole and run at it again,
Man.
So, to simplify, simplify, sure. To bring the things back into what the tension seemed like to me is between perception and imagination, where our perceptions govern so much of how we interpret the world, in contrast to that new idea that breaks in on us, that new image that comes, and it's like, what is it that gives me the nerve that touches into that energetic place in the universe that then enables rather than prevents my participation?
Jerry, you're beautiful.
Oh, man.
Thank you.
This is beautiful. Thank you for entertaining this.
Yeah.
I come to it with this understanding that I could not have arrived at without conversation with you, that, we need to just put the big C in place of the big T for the time being. Our new TV heroes would not be Mr. T, but Mr. C, and
That's amazing.
Some collaboration between Mr. T and Mr. C or something, right? So as images go.
We could literally talk for 2 more hours.
Yeah.
I would like to transition this towards the ending with something that might actually take up more a few minutes of time. That's completely okay. From our discussion last, I wrote down a lot of notes. Something that could be really beautiful to get into right now would be dealing with ambiguity through discourse, and what that actually means, and what is the purpose in that sense of discussion, of discourse, of communication or conversation. Please lead the way.
Well, thankfully, somebody has memory. When you say ambiguity, right away a term came in my mind, maybe because of some after effect or some halo effect of our conversation about energy, but I think not only of ambiguity, but ambivalence. And I would kind of start here maybe as I'm just doing my own
Could you
thinking.
describe that?
Yeah, I'm trying to make a connection here between ambiguity and ambivalence. We know that ambivalence is, I'm kind of ambivalent about whether I want to do this, whether I want to do that. And I would say that it rests upon something like what we would call ambiguity, the uncertainty factor,
Okay.
right? I'm not sure the outcome of this. I'm a little more sure the outcome of this, the certainty principle that comes into play. The self-serving bias that comes into play, confirmation bias that comes into play. All of those are elements that are a consequence of the ambiguities that we face. And I think what I probably referred to as Ricoeur's general outline of discourse, having taking three different shapes in terms of forms of discourse: scientific, ordinary, and poetic discourse. And each of these necessarily have to come up with a strategy to deal with ambiguity, both the ambiguity that's in language and the ambiguity that is detailed in our experience as interpreters. I've made wrong decisions because I wrongly interpreted things. That doesn't have to have a moral value placed on it, but there are some interpretations are better than others. And consequently, we realize that we have to deal with that ambiguity that you are concerned about, that would at least in some way assuage probably the ambivalence I feel about acting or turning in this direction or another. we'd like to have an algebra so that when we look at science and its form of discourse, Ricoeur talks about how it is a strategy that seeks to eliminate ambiguity. I mean, we don't come up with different ideas about north. We don't come up with different ideas about Ohm's law. These are things that are very fixed and they're predictable. We're all going to come up with the same answer. The social world is not quite like that. In what would be ordinary discourse, our everyday talk, and for that matter, I want to add to the chagrin probably of a lot of social scientists that the social discourse is far from a science. It's more characterized as an art when it's even practiced well. How we rightly read our neighbors, how we can see people in the light that shows them of something more than a figuring, that is to say, as a number, just one more that is to be counted, but in some real way see the glory in them. See our social sciences haven't taken us in that direction, or so it seems to me. Humanist discourse more so, where we make, I think, more of an effort to understand people with sympathies, compassion. The extreme form of ordinary discourse, I think, is what happens when we just miscommunicate about where we're going to end up today. Mm-hmm. There are several Javas, so you have to kind of specify it's on 6th Street and not the one in Hyde Park. Otherwise, you're in Hyde Park and your partner is on 6th Street. Poetic discourse, on the other hand, Ricoeur says the strategy it's developed to deal with ambiguity is to invite it, to exploit it, to let it manifest in its fullness, because it's out of that the creative poiesis, the very nature of language is to morph in that way and metaphorize. And it's through that very ability of metaphorizing that we create our world. The world is like this. And that means if I get up in the morning and the world is just another grind, it'll probably be another grind. It might even the vice might be tightened up a little bit more. Or whether I get up with a awakening to, here comes a new sun, wow. Here comes a different world. I think in part at least has to stem from how we will open ourselves to that poetic and again invite a new myth.
Imagination. Full
Exactly.
circle.
Exactly. So
that's incredible. Yes. In my notes here, we have the 3 types of discussion. Ordinary, the goal is to minimize ambiguity. Scientific, the goal is to eliminate ambiguity, straight to the point. Poetic welcomes ambiguity, to explore it, to exploit it, to look at things a little bit differently, to build that imagination. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Let me just add quickly, because I hear Ricoeur speaking to me right now. One of the things, and by the way, he's passed on, so for anybody that's listening that knows that Paul Ricoeur is no longer alive, I still listen to him. One of the things that he insisted that these 3 forms of discourse that he had outlined were certainly not, in his view, kind of comprehensive. There are other forms of discourse probably as we start parsing those down a little bit more. And I've tried to do that with the distinction between ordinary, humanistic, and social science kinds of discourse. So, but Ricoeur here would have you know that it's like those aren't the only ones. Let's keep our imaginations open to, where does the comic fit in that? Where does the irony fit in that? Where does the masterfulness of narrative fit in that? There are narratives that don't necessarily, they aren't enhanced as extremely as the poetic might be. So, let's leave it open to some play.
You brought a book.
I did.
Would you care to share something to end this episode with?
Well, there's a couple of these that Rumi is kind of my source of playing around with my own images as well as the images that this poet of Persian origin, who has so widely influenced much of the Islamic world, the Christian world, even the world of Judaism, is influenced by Rumi's poetry. And this one in particular that I've tried to... Actually, there's two. They're short, so
Perfect.
I love this. This is one entitled "Earsight." Earsight. He says, "Do you want the sweetness of food, or the sweetness of the one who put sweetness in food? There are amazing things in the ocean, and there is one who is the ocean. Think of a carpenter's alert comprehension when he builds a house. Now think of the one who creates consciousness. It takes skill to extract oil from a nut. Now consider how sight lives in the eye. There's a night full of the wildness of wanting. Then dawn comes. You take my hand in yours. There are those who doubt that this can happen. They pour powdered gold into barley bins. They follow donkeys to the barn. Enough words, friend, you can make the ear see. Speak the rest of this poem in that language." Yeah. There's a lot to think about, there.
Yeah, that nut line stood out to me.
Yeah, did it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's beautiful.
You've built houses?
No,
You've done carpentry work?
a little, just hardly.
And just think of all the thought that, and the forethought and the know-how that has to combine.
It's incredible. I think we take a lot for granted.
Oh my gosh. How about this one? At least asleep and listening. Asleep and listening. And I got to tell you, this one keeps me wondering all the time. Day before yesterday, fire whispered to the fragrant smoke, "Aloes wood loves me because I know how to untie it and let it loose." If you've ever had any aloes wood, it's a very fragrant wood that's been produced by a resin from a wound in the tree, and its fragrance is just incredibly perfumed presence. It's just an incredible fragrance. This burning must occur or nothing will happen. Sperm cell disappears into egg, then a new beauty appears. Bread and broth must dissolve in the stomach before energy comes. Raw ore gets refined into coins. It is necessary for you to experience non-being. Love takes you toward that. Asleep beside the splashing water, let it say secrets into you. Be asleep and a pure listening at the same time. And of course, that's a source of the poetic imagery that, hopefully it will enrich your own imagination. And certainly, by working at it, it will improve your managing ambiguity and thereby help you to become a better interpreter in the world.
Jerry, Catt,
Hey, Darren,
thank you so much for being here.
thank you.
That was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for hosting us.
We'll have to
Thank you for
do
the
it
work
again.
you're doing with it. Yes. Yeah. Love it.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, great.
Until next time.
All right.